Hi there. I've put this video together and it may be able to help other people that have hit the same problem that I have, and that is got a Mavic Air, the batteries have been left too long in storage and they're now dead and will not charge. And the symptom of these is that pressing the button on the battery has no effect, the LEDs don't light, and the battery won't charge when you connect it to the charger. And the root cause of this is that some or all of the individual cell voltages are too low, and the intelligent electronics has permanently shut down the battery and shut down its power output, which means you can't get any power from it and nor can you charge it. Now at the moment these batteries seem to be unavailable. They're selling used for about £80 on eBay, so it did seem worthwhile trying to recover these if I possibly could. Now there are some instructions on YouTube, one using a very specialist device which I discounted because the idea of it is that you can reset the battery electronics, but without knowing exactly what it is you've got to reset, I think it would be quite difficult to do. And the other method that I found, although the video was in Russian, was to essentially charge up the batteries separately, although this chap actually used different batteries, but charge up the batteries separately and then reflash the firmware, and that reset the battery. And that's the method I followed, and in my case it was successful. Now the health warning here is that this worked for me, but I can't be absolutely sure that it would work for anybody else. So, follow the steps. You might be able to modify them, you may be able to improve upon them, and it may be applicable to other drones as well. But I can't guarantee that it's going to be successful. So the steps involved are, first, we need to open up the battery. Second, we need to check the individual cell voltages. 3, we need to recover any low voltage cells if we can. If we can't, we'll have to use some other techniques, and we'll come on to those later. We then need to charge the cells, and it is important to get some charge into the cells. We're then going to connect the battery to the drone, but with the ability to bypass the electronics in the battery, and that sounds more complicated than it actually is in practice. Start up the drone and then flash the firmware, and flashing the firmware seems to reset the battery electronics, and then the battery gets back to normal. Now for this to be successful, you will need to have and be familiar with basic electronic test equipment, power supplies and multimeters, and to be a little bit handy around the workshop with a few things that you're going to need to make it successful. Okay, the equipment materials required are a bench power supply, which is going to give you constant current and constant voltage, 2 multimeters or equivalent, because you're going to need to measure current and voltage, various leads and wires, soldering iron, cutters and basic electronic tools. And then if you follow exactly the same method that I did, you're going to need some 1mm thick plastic sheet, some adhesive copper strip, this is quite readily available, a battery charging lead plug for the Mavic Air battery, and I bought a used Mavic Air battery charger and just cut that off, and then some copper nails, bits of wood and some other odds and sods. Okay, well, the battery principles. It can look a bit intimidating, the battery, because it seems to have 10 connections on it, but in fact it's not quite as complex as it seems. The battery has got 3 lithium polymer LiPo cells within it, some intelligent electronics, and then 10 pins, but of those 10 pins which output from the battery, 4 are negative, 4 are positive, and then there are 2 data bus control signal pins. So in essence there are only 4 different connections. So a relatively straightforward thing. The first thing we need to do is to open the battery, and the way that I did this was to use a small watchmaker screwdriver, which I could just get between the gap between the 2 halves of the case, and release the clip. By then easing the case open a little bit more and keeping it open, I could release another clip, and then it was easy to sort of go around the whole of the case and just ping the clips undone. You can see here in the picture where 3 clips are on one side, same on the other side, and some on the ends. And often opening things like this, knowing where the clips are is the battle. Once you know where the clips are, you can open it. Couple of points: don't be too heavy-handed, particularly at the end where the electronics are. You don't want to stab the electronics with a screwdriver or some other sharp object that you're using to open the case. And much more importantly, the two halves of the case are connected together with a wire, because the clips on the side of the battery that hold the battery in position are essentially switches, and there is a wire connection between those switches and the main electronics. So once you've undone the clips around the case, don't sort of yank the two halves apart, because you'll break those wires. Okay, well, looking here at the top of the battery, with the connector sort of facing you, very conveniently the top of the three cells are actually visible through the cutouts in the printed circuit board. And you can see there I've just labelled them for my own convenience, A, B and C. Note that the way this is orientated, A and C have positive on the left hand side and battery B has positive on the right hand side. And you can see there the voltages that I measured, and obviously certainly cells, all cells are low and B and C are very low. And for a half charged and then a fully charged LiPo cell, you should be looking at about 3.9 to 4.2 volts. So these are well low, and that's why the electronics has cut it all off. Now you need to get some connections to those batteries so you can charge them. Don't try and solder to them, you won't be successful. What I did was to get a strip of wood, put in a couple of copper nails at the right distance between them, and use that to connect to the battery by placing it on top like this. Careful that you don't go and stab the electronics on the printed circuit board itself with your pins, so a little bit of care of course required. And then a little bit Heath Robinson, but just propped up on some bits of wood, a little bit of foam under the battery itself because that acts as a little bit of a spring, a couple of old bits of lead pipe just to hold it all in position. Because you need to make sure you've got good contacts to those batteries, and they can be a little bit jiggled around. There might be an easier or better way of doing it, but this seemed to work quite well. Okay, so I started charging them. Now I know LiPo cells can be tricky to charge, and there's always a risk that they could be permanently damaged. So I started off with extremely low currents, here only 5 milliamps, and slowly the voltage started to come up, and I then increased that to 10 milliamps for a period of time, and then to 50 milliamps for several hours, checking all the time the battery wasn't doing anything weird or making weird noises or getting too hot. Now the first test to do that is if you disconnect your charging supply, if the battery voltage holds up, then the cell is probably coming back. If it just drops away again back to the sort of level it was when you first tested it, then that might indicate that the cell is permanently damaged. But in my case, the voltage did hold up, and I charged it at 50 milliamps for several hours, and then charged it about 200 milliamps for a number of hours, but keeping a close eye on it, again to make sure that the battery isn't permanently damaged and isn't going to overheat or do anything like that. And you're looking for an end voltage on each of the three cells of at least 3.9, and preferably 4 or slightly above. Now, it may not be possible to achieve that because you're charging these sort of manually rather than through a proper LiPo charger. So I think the message here is take it steady and take it easy, and don't try and overcharge it too quickly. But if you're successful, you'll get some charge back in the battery, and you'll then be able to go on to the next step. So what we need to do here is we need to connect the battery to the drone, but we've got to be able to bypass the electronics. So there are 4 connections that are required, which is the negative, the positive, and the 2 data bus control signal connections, plus the ability to connect from the positive of the battery stack to the positive supply of the drone. And we can't obviously do that by plugging the battery in, because if we plug the battery into the drone, we will not be able to make that connection. So we've got to find another way of doing it. You only need to bypass that positive. You don't need to bypass any of the others connections there. So that's what we have to do. So looking again just at the top of the battery, that connection there is the top of the 3-cell stack, and it's that positive, which is the full battery voltage of all 3 of them, that you'll need to use for that bypass. So as I said earlier, I bought a Mavic Air charger, battery charger off of eBay, and cut the wire, suitable length, then strip that back. And what you'll see here is that there are three cores within that. The first is a thick white, which actually is the positive supply. The silver screen is a negative supply, and then there is a thin blue wire, which is one of those two data bus connections. Now, if you remember from the previous slide, we need to make 4 connections between the battery and the drone, positive, negative, and the 2 data connections, but we've only got one of them here. This is looking at the side of the plug as it goes into the battery, showing where the negative and the positive are. The existing thin blue wire is connected to the pin as shown, but we need to make an additional connection so that we can get access to that other pin. And the way that I did that was to carefully carve away the other side of the plug until the 2 pins were visible. We only need to make a connection to one of them that you can see here, and you can see that it's just a short piece of wire and just a little dab of solder. It's not taking any current, so it doesn't need to be a very thick wire. The other pin there that you can see is actually connected to the thin blue wire, but you can't see that. And that thick wire is the white wire that goes to the positive terminals. So you need to take a little bit of care, but you can get to the rear of those pins and make that additional connection. And of course, once you've done that, just double check that you have made the right connection to the right pin. Okay, we're looking at the drone side now. We've got to get a negative to the left 4 pins, positive to the right 4 pins, the thin blue wire to that pin as indicated, which is next to negative, and that additional connection that we've just talked about going into the pin next to the positive terminals. We don't want to damage those pins for obvious reasons. We need to be very careful, and they are too close together for clips. So I devised another way of making satisfactory connections. So it goes without saying, first of all, that you don't put anything in place while the battery's connected. We connect everything up and check it all before we do any connections of batteries. But what we have here are some small strips of plastic, 1mm thick, and on each side I have stuck on some of that double-sided copper tape. It's widely available, that tape, and these are very quick and easy to make. Cut 10 little bits of plastic, stick them onto a bit of tape, trim around them with a sharp knife, stick them on another bit of tape, trim around it again, and you've got copper tape on both sides. And that makes a good connection. It doesn't bend the pins, it doesn't stress the pins, but it makes a good connection. You'll need to solder to the copper strips, and this needs just a very quick dab, as I'm showing here. So as you can see, it doesn't require any sort of lengthy time. If you keep the soldering iron there too long, it'll just melt the plastic and melt the adhesive. If you happen to do that, you just make some more. But it's just a quick dab, as you can see. And then here we can see them all in position. The 4 on the left on the negative, the 4 on the right the positive, and then you can see the 2 data wires in the middle. And you can see I put some insulating, I've soldered some copper wire to those, but I put some insulating sleeving on, and just a little bit of plastic between those so they don't short together. 2 very important things at this point: check you don't have any shorts. I did that with my own meter or my multimeter to make sure that I haven't got any shorts, particularly between the negative and that data wire which is next to the negative. Likewise on the positive, the data wire that is next to the positive. Check that you've got everything correctly wired, the correct polarity, left hand ones to the negative, which is that screen if you're using a Mavic charger cable, and the right hand one shown here will go to the positive and also used for the bypass. What I always recommend with something like this is that if you've got any doubt, wire it all up, check it, go and have a cup of coffee and come back and check it again. That's always a good thing. If you're not too sure, just to make sure it's absolutely right. I've destroyed many things over the years by just being a little bit too quick and not double checking all my connections. So this is basically now what we're going to do. We have a connection. We've got the Mavic Air plug showing here. We've got the silver screen wire going to the negative, thin blue to that left hand data wire, thick white going to the positive, that additional connection shown here in green going to the right hand data bus connection, and then that bypass. So we've got everything connected up. We put the plug onto the Mavic Air battery. Don't need to touch the battery, we don't need to switch it on or anything like that, and we put that bypass in place. Now, I thought at one stage that might need to be in place for some time, but once you connect that, the drone will boot. And once it's booted, you can just take that wire away and it will continue to power itself from the battery. But it's important to note this time that the battery is not reset. I'm not quite sure why it does that. It doesn't reset the battery, but it then does start to take power from the battery. So you can then discard that bypass wire. The actual drone is booted and running from the battery itself without the bypass wire. I then connected it to my Windows PC, which is running the DJI Assistant 2 app, and what it detected was a firmware mismatch, and I think that was because the drone firmware was at a higher level than the battery firmware. So it asked me if I wanted to update it. I said that I did, and it started that update process. You might be able to do this through the DJI Go 4 app, I don't know, but I used the app running on the PC. And it goes through that update process and then hopefully completes successfully. One thing to note, the drone will reboot several times during this process. And when it does, this screen gets minimized. So you think it's completed, but it's down on your taskbar. So just click on that again and make sure you get right the way through the update process until it's complete. And it's all rebooted, it's all completed, and voila, what we have here are 2 green lights on the drone itself, which is extremely good news, and also, as you can see, 2 green lights on the battery. So it's now reset the battery electronics. You can see there a block of wood and a yellow lead. I used that for the bypass because I thought the bypass might need to be in place for longer, so I made a sort of semi-permanent arrangement while I was setting all this up. But in fact, that bypass doesn't need to be in for a very long period of time. So on that basis, you don't really need anything particularly sophisticated. Once it's got to this point, what you then need to do is to switch off the drone in a normal way, and that's by pressing the button on the battery twice, and then that will shut it down. And then you can take the battery, clip the case back on, and then put it into the Mavic Air charger in the normal way. If you don't get a message saying that there's a firmware mismatch between the drone and the battery, it does seem to be possible to refresh the firmware through the DJI Assistant. Now, I haven't actually tried this, but looking at this screen, it seems to give the option. One thing though I am pretty sure about is it won't let you do that if it thinks the battery is less than 50% charged. So it comes back to the point I made earlier, you do need to get some charge in the batteries. If you have to go down this route and do this refresh and you get the message that the battery needs to be 50% charged, you'll need to go back to that earlier step and charge the batteries, the individual cells, to get some extra charge in them. It doesn't seem to make that check when it's just reflashing the firmware in the battery, which is the process that I was able to follow. So it does seem to be another way of doing it, but I stress again, you will need some charge in the batteries. Well, okay then, has all of this made a difference? Well, I charged the batteries in the normal way, I had 2 of them. This is the first one, plugged into the drone, and we can see there it's showing 2 voltages very healthy, the other one's not too bad, it's a little bit low. Not sure if that's because it's lost its charge or it's maybe the way they normally do it, I don't know. And I've got a low battery warning at 30%, and it got to that running the drone for about 9.5 minutes. And that was running some video and just hovering. Might not be so long if you're flying up and down and around and about, but certainly hovering at a stable height with the camera running, I got about 9.5 minutes out of it, so that was good. On the second battery, this is showing the position where it comes up with the 30% low battery warning. As you can see there, one cell now is down to about 3.42, and the flight time though, just over 10 minutes, so about the same sort of capacity as the other one. Again, running video and taking some pictures. So it seems that both those batteries have certainly recovered some level of capacity. Whether that'll improve in time, whether it won't last as long, I don't know. But certainly it's made a difference and managed to get some life into those batteries, certainly so they're usable for some flying. We just need to be a little bit careful and keep an eye on them over several charges. So I hope that's been helpful. There may be other ways that you can modify this process. I suppose the takeaways from this is keep the batteries charged. We've probably all got cameras and things, and they don't seem to be anywhere near as sensitive. But these intelligent batteries are certainly very, very finicky in that sense. You need to keep them charged. If you follow this method and the batteries can be recovered, it seems that they can be done successfully, so you should be able to get somewhere. But I think perhaps more importantly, it does give the option to replace those batteries. If those LiPo cells just can't be recovered, you could take them out and replace them with some different LiPo cells. And in fact, that Russian video that I referred to earlier did in fact do that, and use an external charger to charge them. And that might well be a way of doing it and prolonging the life and the use of the drone if you wanted to replace those batteries. I think you'd obviously have to be careful of weight. You wouldn't want to make them much heavier or maybe even lighter. It may upset the drone's balance, but that might also be an option. So the final point to make is, I re-stress, be careful of the batteries. I know LiPo batteries can be a bit temperamental, and you've got to be careful how you charge them. So there may be other people watching this video that know more about them than I do, and maybe I'll suggest other ways of charging them. But certainly this has been successful, and with second-hand batteries running at about £80 each, to recover two of these, certainly with some usable life in them, seemed like a good idea. So I hope that's been useful. If you post any comments, I'll try and answer any questions if I possibly can, and good luck.